It's really good to be here. I'd come out, I don't know, what, sometime last year, I guess, was the first time we talked. Talking a little bit about how we can talk and cooperate a little bit more, how we can work a little bit more together to kind of get issues out that are of common interest to us. So I get a little better understanding of where all of you guys are. Are all of you business majors? Or some of you liberal arts taking a business course? Give me a little, I mean, how many are business majors? Okay, we got a lot of business majors. How many of you are not business majors but thought, okay, a couple of people who fall into that category? Good. As was said, I represent Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. And put quite simply, we're an advocacy organization for the business community. So before I even, how long do we have to go today?
Oh, you had a good 50 minutes.
Okay, good. I'm going to leave
time for questions.
I want to leave a lot of time for questions. In fact, if something comes up and you say something, and you hear something you don't like, you hear something doesn't make sense to you, just stick your hand up. I mean, I'm fine with that. So we are the advocacy group for business. So largely what we do is we, on behalf of our members, and our members are every size company you can think of, every large company you can think of in Pennsylvania that does business in Pennsylvania, everybody from the U.S. Steels, the Comcast, the UPS, Walmart, all the way down to some of the smallest companies, literally sometimes the corner store, the corner grocery store, the corner whatever type of retail or other type operation there is, and every size in between, all across Pennsylvania. So every place from Philadelphia area up to Erie and Pittsburgh, all the way up into Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and everything in between. So what we do is we work with the legislature to talk a little bit, to tell them what it will take to make business competitive in Pennsylvania, what it will take to make Pennsylvania competitive among other countries and states, and what it will take to move Pennsylvania forward such that when all of you guys get out, hopefully you're going to have jobs and be able to stay around Pennsylvania. For those, how many of you are from Pennsylvania, by the way? Okay. Any students from other countries here? Have a couple? Okay, great. So we want to make sure that we have a situation where Pennsylvania businesses can be competitive. And unfortunately, as you study, many of you might have had some economics courses, political science courses. You know that sometimes government can implement policies that sometimes well-meaning have the unintended consequence. Sometimes I think there's an intended consequence to make it tougher for business to operate. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some real-life situations. Some of them are issues that I've worked on, and I'm not going to read off these, but I just want to make sure that I lay this out so I kind of make sure I touch on some of the things that I want to do. As I mentioned, that's the chamber. We have thousands of members across Pennsylvania. Our organization, we've got about 60 employees in the chamber. About half of that sell our insurance products. We sell health insurance to our members and local chambers. Now, many of you might be familiar with local chambers. You know, the Elizabethtown Chamber, the Lancaster Chamber, the York Chamber. They are members of mine. I don't own them. I don't direct them. I don't control them. We work together on issues, but we are two totally separate organizations, just like how many of you have heard of the United States Chamber, the U.S. Chamber? Completely separate. I do a lot of work with the U.S. Chamber. I was down there on Monday, as a matter of fact. They don't own me. I don't own them. We choose to belong. We choose to cooperate together, particularly when I work federal issues. As was mentioned, I've been at the Chamber now for 10 years, almost a year and a half of that as president. Prior to that, I spent 3 years with a law firm running a government relations practice, even though I'm not a lawyer. So for those of you who want to go to law school, it's an interesting experience being a non-lawyer in a law firm. Prior to that, I spent 20 years in the oil industry. I spent 13 with a company you might have heard of called British Petroleum. I was with their U.S. affiliate called BP America. I started out in a refinery where I grew up outside Philadelphia, 2 years on shift work, rotating shift. You work roughly 6 days of 7 to 3. You have a couple, 2-3 days off. Then you work 3 to 11, 2-3 days off. Then you work 11 at night till 7 in the morning. 2 years is just about long enough to know you never want to work shift work again in your life, at least for me. And in a refinery, what you learn is that every day is simply the same day. Christmas, you're working. Easter, you're working. Thanksgiving, if your shift's on, you're working. So it gives you a little better idea of what a lot of people in our society go through and the challenges they have on a workday basis. From the from the refinery outside Philadelphia, they transferred me to Atlanta, where speaking from Philadelphia, I had to learn a whole new language, speaking Southern. It was very interesting. I didn't understand my secretary. She had no idea what I was saying. It took a while for us to get on the same language. I worked government affairs. I worked 6 states in the South. I worked North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and then they also threw Illinois in just so I'd have a look at how a state that is really corrupt works. So that was really fun. From there, they sent me to Cleveland, Ohio. We moved from Atlanta, Georgia. Anybody ever been to Atlanta? Really nice weather, pretty nice and calm. We moved from Atlanta to Cleveland just in time for the coldest December in Cleveland history, which was really wonderful. It snowed in October and stayed on the ground till April. So I worked retail marketing there. I did some policy stuff. One of my jobs was also to go out at one time, and I had to go get if you ever traveled the Turnpike, you see all of the places where you can buy fuel. You can go in and get something to eat. I had to go out and get the Ohio Turnpike back because another company had bid that. So because that was their U.S. headquarters in Ohio, I was given the task of going out and getting all of the plazas back and rebidding them successfully. So it was a great project. I really enjoyed it. We did get them back, but it was a great experience from that. Had enough of 6 months of winter, so I moved back from Cleveland back to Pennsylvania. I worked for an organization called the American Petroleum Institute. I ran their Pennsylvania office. They are the trade association for the major oil companies. So my members at API were Exxon Mobil, Chevron, Shell, just a couple of small, relatively independent companies. So that's what I did till I went over to the law firm. Basically what we do now is I kind of summarize to people, and I'm happy to get into, in fact, I would welcome a back and forth exchange to talk a little bit about the bottom line, what we do, and I feel very strongly in it is, in my view, we defend the free market system. I believe the free market system is that system and that method of operation that has taken more people out of poverty and moved more people into a positive situation economically than any other system man's ever invented. I truly believe that. I get up every day believing that, and I get up every day and go into work with my view of protecting and moving that system along. It's not a perfect system. There's no system man has ever invented that's a perfect system. It has its problems, has its checks and balances, it has its things that we need to work on a daily basis, and we do. And part of, I believe, what we do is there are people out there who say, I think the free market system is too raw, it's too ugly, it's too brutal. And it is, on many days it's a terrible system, but it beats the heck out of whatever's second. That's my view. So a lot of what we do is push back, and there isn't, kind of a balance. I mean, you can't have a free market system where anything goes. You can't have a free market system where there's no consumer protections. You can't have a free market system where there's no environmental protections. You can't have a free market system that allows people to do whatever they want and hope they get away with it. So it is a balancing system, as most things are in a human environment. It's a system of checks and balances, as we have in the government. Those of you who studied government know our government, federal government, set up with a system of checks and balances. The executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. I would argue that what we do on an economic basis is kind of do the same things. What's an appropriate check? But I think you have to understand, for every check, every regulation, every piece you have to put in on legislation, you get sometimes an intended and sometimes an unintended consequence. And as I mentioned, I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. Now, for those of you who have an interest in the legislative process, I mean, you've heard all the jokes about, like making sausage, all of those things. And I've been involved in the political world for, almost 40 years now. I started in Philadelphia area politics, so I've been involved in a lot of stuff. I've had elected office outside Philadelphia. I was on a small borough council, which is a great way of kind of learning what local government's about and kind of the entire political, legislative, governmental process to start. The other thing to remember, just to talk about the legislative process and how bills get passed before we get into some of the other issues, is think a little bit about how many of you have a job? What motivates you when you go in to do that job? Yeah, you want to do a good job, but what's your goal at the end of the day when you leave? To what? Still have a job, right? So when people talk about, well, why do people vote the way they do on issues? It's fundamentally the same that I do in the morning, that all the rest of you do in the morning. When you go in, you're going to do as good a job as you can with an eye towards having a job at the end of the day. That's in many cases, the overriding concern. With members of Congress, members of state legislatures, House and Senate, it's no different. They want to have a job at the end of the day. So people always talk about, well, how come nothing gets done? Well, the reality is, if something gets done, it's probably pretty controversial, which means somebody's going to be ticked off one way or another. So their goal, and people always talk about, oh, it's horrible, all of this quagmire, all of this lack of movement, all of this gridlock, you hear the term. First off, our system is designed to make it hard to pass bills. Think about how hard it is to pass a piece of legislation. If I'm a legislator and I have a great idea, I think, for some legislation that needs to be passed, what do I have to do? What's the first step? Those of you who've taken government class, what's the first step if you want to pass legislation? Somebody just holler it out. Nobody had a government class? What's the first step in legislation? What do you got to do? You got to submit a bill, exactly. So then what happens? Now, first off, there's thousands and thousands of bills that are submitted every year. Most of them never go anywhere. After that, what happens? You hope that the chairman of the committee decides to call your bill up. So you have to get through a committee. Let's say that it's a transportation bill. So the chairman of transportation has to call your bill up for a vote. Has to move from transportation committee. Sometimes it has to go to appropriations committee to see if there is what's called a fiscal note. How much is this going to cost the taxpayer if we pass this legislation? So it's introduced in the House, comes out of House Transportation, goes to House Appropriations, has to go onto the full House for passage. Then once you do that, you've only gotten less than 1/2 of the way there. Then it's got to go over to the Senate, go through the whole thing. Has to go into Senate Transportation, pass out of Senate Transportation, pass through the Appropriations Committee, and then you have to have a vote by the entire Senate. In Pennsylvania, you have to get a majority of 50 senators. The Pennsylvania House has 203. So you have to do that, and then what's the last thing has to happen? You got to hope what? There's a certain guy in town in Harrisburg who has a lot of power. Governor has to sign it. So you got to hope that, and there have been bills that have gotten through the House and the Senate, and the governor goes, nope, don't like this one, and vetoes the bill. So it's tough to get stuff through. The system's designed not to do that, and on top of that, there's a whole lot of people who'd be very happy not to have to vote on controversial actions ever. Because the less controversy they're involved in, the greater chance they have of getting reelected. They don't like controversy. So my job is, in a lot of cases, to be honest, the business community and, I'd argue people on the conservative side who say government is too big, most times have a vested interest in not having government action on stuff. So to be honest, a lot of times my job can be, I shouldn't say easy, well, sometimes it is. I only got to find one roadblock. I either have to convince somebody not to introduce a bill, which is really hard because there's so many people and so many people don't agree with where we are. It's easy to get a bill introduced. If any of you want a bill introduced, you can have it done tomorrow. Easiest thing in the world. Tougher thing is getting one passed. But I only got to find a roadblock at one place to stop that. I find a roadblock at the Transportation Committee, if it's a transportation bill, find a roadblock in appropriations, find a roadblock on the floor, wait for over the Senate, find a roadblock there. If I'm not successful there, I go to the governor and try and get him to veto it. Any one of those places stops the bill. So it's not easy to stop a bill, but it's easier to stop a bill than it is to pass one because I got to get through every single one of those roadblocks in order to pass a piece of legislation. So as a result, Pennsylvania, other states, and the U.S., I would argue, from a public policy, typically move pretty incrementally. That is, you don't see these huge wrenching changes. We're going through one right now. Those of you, how many of you in the room are 21? Okay, then maybe you've gone out and purchased alcohol. For those of you who particularly live in other states, no, we have a horrible system for purchasing alcohol. It was set up in the 1930s by a governor who firmly believed alcohol was a huge evil. He set up a system, and he stated this at the time. After we eliminated prohibition, he said, I want to make alcohol as difficult and as expensive to buy as possible. It's one thing that the state government has been tremendously successful in over the last 80 years. They've done a great job of that. Well, now we're talking about what do we need to do to move into the 20th century? And yes, I did not misspeak because so many other states are way ahead of us. We have a state that owns the entire distribution of alcohol, from wholesale to retail. They decide when those stores are open. They're state employees for wine and hard liquor. On the beer side, it is in the private sector, but they're heavily regulated. It's only recently that you can go into a giant grocery store or a Wegmans to buy beer if you're old enough, and they have to set up a restaurant side. So we move incrementally. We're probably not going to eliminate that system overnight. Pennsylvania doesn't do that. Human nature, to be honest, not many people in this room, I'd argue, like change. You don't like to see things change drastically. I have a daughter who's away at college. She's 19 years old. Over the last year or so, my wife and I, well, particularly my wife, because it's more of a big deal to her, has decided to change a lot of things in the house. A new sofa, a new this, a new that. My daughter hates it because this is what she's grown up with. Oh, I love that sofa. That's been there since I was a little kid. Oh, you're getting rid of that. That's horrible. People get attached to things and they don't like to see change. Public policy is, I'd argue, is the same. The other thing that we do on legislative issues is, which is kind of interesting, you all have to do projects, and you all have to do papers, and you all have to do thesis at graduate level. And you have to come up with hard facts and this and that and, you know, rationalize and walk through. To be honest, sometimes we do that in legislation, but a lot of times we don't. We have, in many cases, here in Pennsylvania at the national level, but I think particularly at the state level, what I call legislation by anecdote. What do I mean by that? Each side brings somebody out and says, oh, look at this poor fill in the blank. Man, woman, child, puppy, whatever. This is terrible. We need a law that does this for this person. And they try and get a very emotional pitch to that. It's what I call legislation by anecdote. We find something that's just a really horrible situation, and it might only happen a very small amount of times, but we try and get legislation that's going to match that because we, our side, our group of people, our group of organizations, our group of interests feel strongly about it. So we trot up these, as I call them, legislation by anecdote, and then sometimes, again, this is where you have, and I'll get into in a minute an issue that I think is a clear classic, legislation by anecdote. So we have, rightly or wrongly, a lot of that. Now, when I mentioned interest, too, let me talk about something. You've all heard all the talk about special interest groups. And it makes it sound really horrible. And look, I'm a lobbyist. I'll be the first to admit that. I've been a lobbyist for a long time. I still lobby even though I'm president of the organization. People say, oh, it's a really horrible word, these lobbyists. They have too much sway over the system. I wish I did some days. I really do wish I did. The reality is everybody's got a lobbyist. Everybody's got one. The governor has a lobbyist. The teachers have a lobbyist. Business has a lobbyist. Unions have lobbyists. The old people, they got lobbyists. AARP, one of the strongest lobbyists around. Gun owners have lobbyists. People who don't like guns have lobbyists. We all do. Everybody's got them. This idea that there's some kind of clique of special interest is absolutely wrong. Have any of your parents ever had to call up where they live and say, hey, you didn't get our trash today? Hey, you didn't plow the street today. Guess what? They're special interest. They have a point that only they want to make. They're not arguing for big public policy discourse. They're not arguing to make a huge change. They're arguing because they have a particular point of view and they have a particular interest that's being infringed on. I'd argue they're a special interest too. Let's talk a minute about a couple of these issues and things that we hear in the public discourse that ring with people. People are always trying to find what's a great buzzword that I can use. How many of you watched the President's State of the Union address a little while ago? Okay. How many of you noted his call for minimum wage increase? I'm going to bring this up because I think it's a great business issue too. Give me your thoughts on it. What do you think?
I don't think it'll help very many people.
Why?
I think it'll be a large cost increase for businesses because they pay these workers more. And a lot of times the employees that are getting paid that are maybe part-time young workers, like a kid out of high school. And it's a job that they're not planning on going further in life regardless. So most people who do have that as a full-time job, which is I think who he's trying to appeal to, hopefully they're progressing after working there for so many years and getting pay raises themselves.
So, those in business just greedy? They're hoarding all this money? Shouldn't they be paying somebody more? I mean, who can live on $7.25 an hour?
I agree that's tough, but I think that's the aspect he's going for.
Okay, all right. Anybody else have any thoughts on it?
I think it's a great divisive issue because if you're for it, oh, you're for the little guy, but if you're against it for business reasons, oh, you're a cold-hearted jerk. How can you be against this? But I agree with this guy that ultimately it does increase the cost for businesses to hire another employee. But it's an emotional issue. So, like you said, people will vote on emotion.
Mm-hmm. It is a divisive issue. Anybody else feel differently about it? Okay. It is absolutely a divisive issue. It is one that cuts both ways, and it's one that we are actively involved in. I was involved a few years ago when Pennsylvania moved to $7.25 at the state level. Now the president's proposing to go to $9. Will it cost some businesses more? Yeah, it's probably going to make some businesses more. Is it going to get some people a raise? Yeah, it will. But here's the other reality of a situation that sounds good, and I know that it's politically popular. The trouble is sometimes politically popular ideas that sound good. Hey, shouldn't everybody make a fair wage? Anybody disagree with the fact, people, anybody disagree with that? Shouldn't everybody make a fair wage? Shouldn't everybody make a wage they can live on? Okay, what's fair? And as you point out, not 100% of the people making minimum wage are people raising a family at home. In fact, it's a very small percentage of them. Most of them fall into these categories: students, a working spouse who has a spouse who might be making a pretty good salary, $75,000 a year, who's decided to go out and earn a little money, maybe to save for kids' college or save for a vacation or whatever. Some of them are transcending, as you said, they're kind of transferring through that system. And they're down at minimum wage or trying to get their foot in the door, et cetera. The problem we have is that we have to fight back against these things. Well, people pound the table. Everybody needs to make a fair wage. Business, and I've seen this. I love to read the comments on news stories, which in my view are usually more interesting sometimes than the news stories, in which people will say, it's just these greedy business people. They're just holding on to the money. They just need to pay people a fair wage. And in fact, I've gone on TV to argue against there's a group in town that's a labor economy group, and I use labor with a dual meaning deliberately. They argue for labor issues, but they also are largely paid for and are the interest of labor organizations. So you will never see this group, even though the two guys I know, I like them. You know, they're good guys, they're smart guys, but they come from a particular bent. They have never disagreed with organized labor on a single issue that I can find. So they want this, and they come out with it's a fair wage issue. People should be paid fairly. They say, in fact, not only will this not cost money, it's going to make business money because people will have more money to spend in the community. Does that ring with anybody? We should do this because it puts more money into the community? Anybody, does that ring with anybody? Well, that's one of the things that they argue. But what they forget to say is the money has to come from somewhere. There's no free money unless you're in Washington printing money and you get to raise the debt ceiling every time you feel like it. The reality is the money has to come from somewhere. So we have to push back on that. And I have to argue with these guys about here's why it doesn't make sense from an economic perspective to do this. But I think we need to move beyond economic perspective sometimes. And the reality is this. I've said to people, great, pass the minimum wage. How high do you want the unemployment rate to go? Because the reality is the minimum wage most hits people who are young, starting out, very little skills, looking to acquire the skills and the talents and those things that they need to advance in the world. Those people tend to be 18 to 29. The unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate for people 18 to 29 is 13.1%. For African Americans who are 18 to 29, that rate is 22%. If you take it 18 to 24, both of those numbers climb astronomically. If you talk about African American youth in the inner city, that number is around 50%. So how high do you want it to go? If they're not being employed at $7.25 an hour, because the reality is what the market is saying to people who are unemployed with a minimum wage rate of $7.25, the market is saying, I don't value you at $7.25. That's what the market is saying, really, when you get down to it. I don't value what you bring to my business at 7.25. So if they're not being hired at 7.25, why would they be hired at $9 an hour? The analogy I've used with people is this. I know you guys are all young, but some of you in the room have probably, and certainly your parents have, sold a house or tried to sell a house. You put your house on the market and you ask $150,000 for it. It doesn't sell in 6 months. What the market is telling you is, I don't value your property at $150,000. So what do you do in that case for those of you who've had to sell, or take a guess what your parents or others would do? House on the market, $150,000 on the market for 6 months, what do? You lower the price. Okay. But I've just said the analogy here is you're on the market at 7.25 and you're not having people buy your service. The answer is raise your price. Doesn't make sense to do it for a house, doesn't make sense to do it for employment either. I want those people to work. We need to get them in the door. We need to get them acquiring the skills and talents and abilities they need to be successful in life. You don't do it by making them more expensive to hire than they can bring to the job. It's a real problem, and again, I understand why it's so popular, and it's sometimes why business is seen as being cold-hearted. The reality is, it simply doesn't work. There's a reason why Bill Clinton, who was president for 8 years and a Democrat, never raised the minimum wage. He didn't believe in it. He thought that it adversely impacted the people it was designed to help, and I think he's right. The reason a lot of the organized labor folks want to do it, I'll make some suppositions here, fairly or unfairly, is if you raise the minimum wage to $9, then the guy who's making $11 an hour goes, hey, I've been with you for 5 years and the minimum wage is $9, I need a raise. So it helps to push the entire wage base up. Now, some people would say that's good. Everybody gets more. The reality is, as I mentioned, those dollars have to come from somewhere. But you have people argue it's good for the economy to put more money in the economy. It doesn't adversely impact employment rates. I think those are wrong. But if raising the minimum wage is good, and I'll close on this point with this one, if raising the minimum wage is so good and so positive for the economy, why stop at 9? Make it $20 an hour. Make it $100,000 a year. Make it the equivalent of the NBA starting salary if putting that amount of money into society works. The reality is it doesn't. You can't governmentally mandate wealth. So that's what we push back. That's one of those issues. How about the other one that's kicking around at the federal level now? How many of you? Absolutely.
About the impact of the increased prices that will be the result of those increased costs on the economy.
You're absolutely right. Business has to respond in a certain way. I'm a business owner. I have X amount of dollars to spend on labor based on what I have. Now, if my labor rates go up because of government pressure, I can respond. And I'm very glad you asked that because it's a great analysis from a business perspective. I have a number of ways, as you know, I can respond. I can simply say, I want to eat the cost. I want to just throw it in there. I can say, hey, you know what? I got 9 people. I'm going to have to make do with 8 people. Therefore, the rest of you who are left have to work harder. That happens. I can say, hey, you know what, that intern I used to hire in the summer, I can't afford them. And I know these are true because after the last minimum wage increase, we canvassed our members and said, how did you deal with it? They didn't bring in interns. They cut some people from full-time to part-time. They raised prices. Now, the folks on the other side, interestingly enough, acknowledge that, well, yeah, you know, if this goes up, it's probably a few cents on the price of a hamburger. That's their quote, not mine. All right, think about that. It's a few price on the cents of a hamburger. It's a few cents on the price of a half gallon of milk. It's a few cents on the price of a box of cereal. It's a few cents on the price of the diapers you have to buy. It's a few cents on the price of the gasoline you have to buy. Well, pretty soon, the person who got the minimum wage increase is eaten up because of additional costs in the system. The other thing that it does, and I know I said it was the last thing, but it was a great question. So businesses have to respond in a certain way. They simply don't have, in most cases, a reserve of money sitting here going, well, I'll just pull it out of this pile of money here. The average small business person's take home is about $50,000 a year, according to the National Federation of Independent Business. doesn't leave a whole lot of money. I ran into a guy the last time we did this. He had a pizza place out in Western PA, and I was talking to him about this. He goes, hey, I can't afford a minimum wage increase. He said, I got a small operation, got a few kids I've hired. I've also got 4 kids at home. I would love to spend more time at home with my kids. But the trouble is, if I bring in that other person to work some of the hours I'm working, I can't afford to pay him $7.25. That eats up those dollars that I have for my family, so I have to work. He's forced to make a choice between spending time with his family as he'd like to do and having to stay in the pizza shop longer than he wants because he just can't afford to bring anybody else on. And there's one final thing that minimum wage increases do. The higher you make labor, because look, labor is another commodity. You know, it's the most, and I know people sometimes get insulted by that, but as business folks, you understand labor's another price of the cost of doing business. Arguably, it's your most important component because these are your people, your lifeblood, your ideas, your enthusiasm, your energy. All those things are absolutely true. But when you have to sit down and run your statement, it's labor personnel benefits cost. It's energy. It's what I pay on taxes. It's what all of the other things that go in. Labor's a component of that. So if your energy prices go up, that you have to factor that in. So people have to think about all of those as well. It is another component of what you have to do business. Any other questions on that before I leave that? Okay. One other thing that we've heard a lot about oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's okay.
A couple of great points on that. Another way businesses could respond is outsourcing the labor, which again, another negative unintended consequence. Also, they would have people work under the table and pay 0 taxes, and or they just lay people off, or just totally shut down, and then everybody loses their job.
Well, and you're absolutely right. As tax rates go up, we know that evasion rates go up, like it or not. It's not right, but we know that happens. And you're absolutely right in terms of labor, which is a point that I had and I forgot to make. I'm glad you brought me back to it. As labor costs go up, alternatives to human labor begin to present themselves. For example, everybody goes to fast food. You pull up, you go to the drive-in, there's a person there says, can I take your order? You tell them what you want, you pull in, you hand them your cash, they give you your change. Sometimes you get the food through that window, sometimes it's the next window. What fast food places have done to adjust for the higher cost of labor have been, when you're talking to that first person, they might not be in that building. McDonald's and others have now worked a system whereby they might be collecting from 10 different stores in that area. So they've had to say, hey, you know what, labor is now too high. There are alternatives to human labor that we can employ. Therefore, those job opportunities for people to get their foot in the door are gone. Absolutely true. The other thing that we found, particularly when we got into, there was a study in Santa Fe that looked at, those of you who understand there's a difference between what's called minimum wage, which is a federally mandated wage. Other places like San Francisco and others have implemented what they call a living wage, which is typically sometimes $3, $4, $5, $6 higher than the minimum wage, and they mandate some of those for city contractors, et cetera. Santa Fe did a study, and the preliminary results, I need to go back and look at the final show, that there seemed to be a correlation between a higher minimum, particularly a higher living wage, and high school dropout rates. Now think about that for a minute. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Now some of this study was done prior to the recession, but think about this for a minute. You got a kid sitting in high school, a junior or senior, 17, 18 years old. They already don't like school. They're not a great student. They're already at risk of dropping out. They can look around and go, hold it, wait a minute. You mean we have a living wage? What's this thing called living wage rate? You mean I can go down to this place and I can make 10 bucks an hour? Oh, let me see, I got car insurance, I got to buy this, I got to buy that. Yeah, I'm doing that. I'm getting out of school if I can get 10 bucks. Well, the reality is the government has set this kid up. This person has been set up because what happens is, this is back in 07, 08, before the economy went down, there were opportunities out there like that. Well, when the economy turns south and those opportunities dry up, those jobs dry up, and sometimes there's layoffs on top of that. We now have taken this kid, we've presented this very enticing thing out here for him or her to do. They've dropped out to take advantage of the 10, 11 bucks an hour, but they failed to acquire the skills that are going to get them through the rest of their life. And we have really, unfortunately, set these kids up, and we present these false choices a lot of times. Let me talk real quick about another issue that's out there that again, I think is one of those very interesting ones. You hear a lot about, when you hear the president and some others say, we can solve our national debt problems by making the rich pay their fair share. How many of you have heard that? Okay. Tell me your thoughts on that. Nobody has any thoughts on that one?
They're already paying more percent-wise than any other.
How do you know?
Because the top 2% pays probably, I don't know exactly, but 40 or 50% of all tax revenue.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts? The rich pay their fair share or not? Doing pretty well, a lot of these people, aren't they? Well, I could have saved some research and just had you do this, but let me give you the exact numbers. Because again, now this gets into the, as you guys always have to do, you're going to present your thought, present a theory, have information to back it up. The theory is that you hear from political people too often is the rich don't pay their fair share. Let me give you some numbers. The top 1%, I don't have the 2%, the top 1%, you hear about all the time, the 99%ers versus the 1%ers. The top 1%, anybody want to guess, how much percent of the total income do they have in a given year of the U.S. income? Top 1%. Somebody guess. No guesses? 8%. Okay, getting close. 18.9. So a little more than double what you thought. What percent of federal income taxes do they pay on that 18.9%? Anybody want to guess that one? These horrible 1%ers. What are they paying income tax? These people aren't paying their fair share.
30.
Very close. 37.4%. So you got 18.9% of the income. They pay 37.4% of all taxes. The top 1% pay more than the bottom 90% combined. Now, I'm not getting into a Mitt Romney thing here about how these people don't pay any taxes, because they do pay some payroll taxes. Some of them are disabled folks. Some of them are retired folks. I get all that. But these are facts, and these need to be laid out on the table when you hear these discussions. The top 5% of income earners in the U.S., they have 33.8% of the income, and they pay just about 60% of the taxes. Now, they're really, really, really rich people, the one we all love to be like, and the ones we all watch TV and all those shows about. The 1/10 of 1%. The 1/10 of 1% have 7.8% of income, but they pay 17.11% of all taxes. Now, let me give you another real interesting statistic to show why I am concerned about what we hear out of Washington, because in my view, there is a perception that's being created that says, we can give you everything you want and need, we can give you everything you need, and you don't have to pay for it, whether it's health care or anything else. We'll find somebody else to pay for it. Somebody else can take care of that. The top 10% have 45% of the income. Now, I know that's disproportionate, I get that. And there's lots of reasons, and that would be a whole other hour discussion, I think, about inequality and equality. That top 10% that has 45% of the income pays 70% of the taxes. Now, somebody give me an example of a country that has a fairly socialistic bent, where people, seems to be a pretty stable country, people seem to be happy, seem to get along. Somebody give me a country that sounds like that. A lot of social programs, but seems fairly stable, well-respected. Give me a country.
Sweden.
Excellent. Boy, I could have had a plan in here for you. Okay, Sweden. Let's compare the 10%. I told you 10% in the U.S., 10% have 45% of the income, they pay 70% of the taxes. A lot of income, but significantly more of their income proportionally goes to the tax side. Sweden, top 10%. Top 10% only have 26.6% of the income. They only pay 26.7% of the taxes. So what that means is the people who are getting the services are paying for the taxes. Here in the U.S., unfortunately, we're moving more and more towards skewing towards that top end. And my concern is we're beginning to create a disincentive for people to go out and become successful. And you may not agree with that, but I am truly concerned about that, where we denigrate people who are successful. Abraham Lincoln, I think it was, had the great comment. He said, you don't make a weak man strong by making a strong man weak. And I'm concerned that that's part of the direction that we're headed. Social programs are growing tremendously in this country. We continue to talk about those who are doing well and unfortunately in many cases denigrate them. The reality is this: if you're going to offer an incentive for people to be successful, you're all going to a private college. We all know what tuition is here. We know what you're putting into it. Many of you want to go on to graduate school. Many of you want to go on to school after that. Maybe some of you are going to go on to become lawyers and doctors, et cetera, et cetera. That's a lot of investment of your time, money, and effort into something. If you don't believe, and many of you here maybe are entrepreneurs who are going to put a lot of work and effort and time and money and resources into developing a new product or service. As you look at that and you don't believe that it's worth it for you at the end of the day because the government appears to be taking too much of your taxes, in my view, that's a huge disincentive to go out and put the work into it. Let me give you an example. I mentioned my youngest daughter. She's a sophomore in college. She has a friend who is extremely bright, goes to Penn. She had a 4.0 at Penn her first year, so obviously a pretty bright kid. She went into the medical side of Penn. She looked at it and she said, I don't want to be a doctor. Well, why not? She went in and did some investigation between the cost of malpractice insurance, because we didn't even get into this, but the U.S. legal reform system has serious problems. Pennsylvania's particularly has problems. She looked at what taxes are, and she looked at the cost of malpractice insurance for being a doctor. She said, I'll stick to being a nurse. So she wants to be an outstanding nurse in her field. She opted not to go that next step because there was a disincentive set up for her to go there. I'm truly concerned we're getting that with entrepreneurs as well. Look, you should make, what would Bill Gates have done if somebody said, hey, you know what, you can do whatever you want, you can go out and invent whatever you want, but we're going to tell you right now, your tax rate's going to be here, and we're going to cap this, and we're going to make sure that you don't, I mean, what's the incentive for Bill Gates and others to go out and invent the next greatest product? It really knocks it down. Income inequality, look, I know we've talked about these numbers. Look, that's not a positive. I'll be the first one to tell you that. Not a good thing to have. How do we go about it? I saw a study by a guy from Georgetown University who said most of the income inequality that we see really is due to educational inequality. We have some horrible education systems in this country where a lot of it's parental involvement. I don't believe it's all, I don't believe money is all of it at all, maybe not even the majority piece, but we have a lot of work we have to do. He believes that it's an education issue. There was a recent study done by an international organization, OECD. They looked at the income inequality issue and they found it to be a tremendous problem in the world. They did congratulate 3 countries over the last 20 years for making tremendous strides on closing the income inequality gap. Those 3 countries are France, Spain, and Greece. You can close the income inequality gap in a good way, or you can close it in a bad way. And that's what I'd offer to you today. Finally, I guess we're getting close to the end here. Okay, real quick, and I'll take some questions if we have time. We hear a lot about whether the free market system really works. We've had a lot of discussions about health care in this country, about health care being a right, and perhaps it is. And some people want to make health care and health insurance, and those are 2 different things. Health care as a right, along with food, clothing, and shelter. And let me just leave you with this and I'll take some questions. And when you think about the free market system and what it delivers, and I believe it does a phenomenal job with the appropriate protections, if we want to make health care right, let's think about that for a minute. Out of all the things, health care, food, clothing, and shelter, which one currently has the most government regulation? I would argue that it's health care. So what we're saying is we need more government regulation on the thing that that already has the most regulation and is increasing faster than virtually any other cost that we have. When you think about the government regulations on food and clothing, they're fairly minimal. Little bit, you have USDA for food, clothing, you have some safety issues, but there's no real restrictions on how much you can sell food or clothing for. Well, there's some on food, but not many. Clothing, not really many. I'd argue that those systems work a heck of a lot better with minimal government involvement and a more rationed, reasonable government involvement than health care. Shelter, I'd argue, on housing worked pretty well until the federal government decided that everybody really should own a house. And they went out and put policies in place that really put people in homes who really didn't have the wherewithal to afford it, and it helped lead to the market. A whole bunch of reasons. I don't want to get into what happened in 2008. But one of the key considerations was we made it too easy for people who probably shouldn't own homes and convinced them they ought to be in a home. And we helped crash that system. Anyway, let me leave it there and just take any questions that you might have, and because I don't want to keep going. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that the Chamber helps advocate for businesses, small and large. When you get issues in the legislature, maybe for, if you want to take the privatization of the liquor stores as an example, do you see differences in what is best for a small business versus a large business, and how do you deal with those discrepancies in your advocacy work and your relations with those businesses?
Sometimes that's a really good question, and we do wind up with it. Most of the time what it involves is I have the big guys who don't care about something and the small people who do. Minimum wage is a classic example. By and large, my big, like U.S. Steel doesn't care really about a minimum wage increase. They understand that indirectly it might lead to an increase over the years, an upward pressure on their union scale wages, but the bottom line is it doesn't hit them immediately. So in most cases, it's one side doesn't care, this side really does. There have been some times when we've gotten one, and liquor's kind of part of it. My grocery stores really want it, my convenience stores really want it. I don't really have anybody who says no to it, but there's a lot who don't care about it. We have had situations where there has been some environmental issues cut that way. And if we can't reach what I told my people, what I call significant consensus, we stay out of it. Now, let me give you a perfect example where we stayed out of something. A few years ago, there was a law that passed in Pennsylvania. Any of you live up around I-80, travel I-80, Interstate 80 across the northern tier? There was a proposal that we were going to toll I-80 to raise money and then distribute that for roads, mass transit across Pennsylvania. They passed a portion of the law, but the piece they needed to really fund it never got through. They were going to toll I-80. Now, we heard from our members, Weiss Markets, you guys have all seen them. Weiss Markets is located up in Sunbury. Their business model is we use I-80 and don't pay a toll. Going back to the question we had about cost. All of a sudden, now you have a tolling issue that puts more cost on to Weiss Markets and some others when they didn't have it before. So they hated it. The concept of tolling I-80 was abominable to them. Now, then I talked to my people down here in the southeast and the southwest. The money's gone to mass transit. UPS has 2 huge facilities in Philadelphia. 60% of their employees use mass transit to get to those 2 facilities. They thought it was a good idea. They were actually willing to pay the tolls. My other people down who are in the southern tier of Pennsylvania said, hey, we already pay to use the turnpike. Those people in the north should pay to use I-80. So we had a very distinct split among not only our membership, but local chambers. We stayed out of the whole fight. We couldn't get what I call significant consensus. It's fairly rare, and I hate to tell people, oh, well, I can't take a position on that, because it sounds like you're weaseling out of it, because I want to take positions on things that are critical to business. But if I'm taking positions on issues where my membership is 52-48, I'm not going to be around very long, either personally or as an organization. So we do have to be careful with that. You're absolutely right. Other questions? Yes?
What do you think we can do to entice more businesses to open up factories and operations in the United States? I know Germany, as you're saying you think maybe the direction they're discouraging entrepreneurs and innovators. Well, it's even worse in Germany where they have caps on CEO salaries. But what can we do to encourage more foreign direct investment in the U.S.?
Funny you mention that. We're working on it. In fact, just last year, I don't know how many of you saw, the governor did a trade mission over to France and Germany. I went along with it. I've never been over there before. It was fascinating. The Germans are actually making a conscious decision also to exit the nuclear market. Therefore, I anticipate that their energy costs are going to go higher. I think that we as a country can do a number of things. One, we can reform our taxes at the federal level. The U.S. has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Pennsylvania has the highest effective corporate tax rate in the United States. So arguably Pennsylvania has the worst corporate tax rates in the entire world. So we can reform our tax rates, make it easier to bring profits from overseas back here, not double tax them. That's one. The energy thing is another tremendous example of a way that we can offer to others, particularly here in Pennsylvania. We have the second largest natural gas field in the world in the Marcellus. How many of you have heard the term Marcellus? I mean, it's everywhere anymore. A few years ago, people wondered if it was real. It's real. The wells are producing more than we even anticipated. So we can tell people that Pennsylvania and the U.S. is moving towards a position of energy security. I don't like the word energy independence. Energy security, where we can produce oil, natural gas, work with trading partners such as Canada, which has extensive amounts, and I know there are environmental concerns there. I get that. I was at a meeting yesterday with the Brazilian ambassador to the U.S. in which he talked about what Brazil was developing. So we can work trading partners in this hemisphere, stop buying crude oil from people who don't like us and use the money they get from us to come after us, or we can develop our own and figure out which trading partners work. If we can advertise ourselves as being energy secure, and I'll give you a perfect example. Procter & Gamble has a huge plant up in northern Pennsylvania, up in a place called Mahoupany. Procter & Gamble's plant, they make, I think, diapers and some paper towels up there. They went from being effectively the highest cost facility in the entire Procter & Gamble system to the lowest, and they did it one way. They found a Marcellus reserve on their property. They drilled it. They used it to power their entire operation. That's how we can advertise to people that you can come over here. We do have to work on workforce issues, but those are some things that are very much a positive where we can show other countries and other companies that they can invest here. We do have a lot of investment already, but I think we can do better. Other thoughts? Yes?
You listed a lot of reasons why we shouldn't increase the minimum wage. Would there be any benefits to possibly maybe decreasing it down to maybe like 6?
Well,
I'm not saying it would pass, but.
no, you've accurately summarized it. If you decrease it, you do open up the possibilities that we'll be able to employ more people. I don't ever see it going in because politically you've hit on it. It has no chance of passing. People are never going to say, I'll agree, because the other side is going to argue you're reducing people's wages by that. I would argue that's not necessarily true. People get to take their wages and sell them just like they do any other product anywhere they want to go. Wages are no different. They don't like to hear that, but as we talk about, that's a service that you have to offer, and it's a cost that someone else factors into their determination. Would we gain some? We probably would, particularly for some of these kids who are looking to get their first start in business, dropping it to 6, or I hate to say it, since we're only in a classroom and there's no media here, what if you didn't have one? What if you could agree and somebody walks in and, hey, how much would you pay me to sweep the floor so I can get started? I'll give you $2. That's not worth it. The guy down the street was $4. What if there wasn't one? What if there was no minimum wage? So it's, I think, a reasonable debate to have. What's interesting is, which leads to a point, the last time we passed it in Pennsylvania, many of the people in Philadelphia were among the most strongest advocates. And the newspapers in Philadelphia were among the most strongest advocates, the Inquirer and the Daily News. And they said, we need to do this, it's fair, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one I found very interesting, newspapers have exempted themselves from many provisions of the minimum wage. So they recognize the detrimental impacts. They had their lobbyists, newspapers have lobbyists too, by the way. They had their lobbyists go and get exemptions from the minimum wage for the newspaper industry. The year after the minimum wage passed, that Philadelphia folks wanted so badly, they were congratulating a member of the state house who went to Harrisburg and got hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money to subsidize a summer youth job program because, according to the news article in the paper that supported it, there are fewer job opportunities this summer because of the increase in minimum wage. Duh, we told you that last year. So we had to get taxpayer money to subsidize what we told them was going to happen. So, hate to say it, sometimes you feel good when you see those things, but anyway, that's a good point. Anything else? Yes?
I got a lot of questions.
That's fine. I love questions.
Labor unions, what kind of arguments are they making? We need more unionized labor in the U.S., considering their defeats in Wisconsin and Michigan recently. And how would you counter their arguments?
I shouldn't say very simple because there's none of these issues are simple. I think everyone at the appropriate level, you can't have management in a union. Everyone at the appropriate level should have the chance to be in an organized should have the chance to be in a labor union. They should have the chance to be represented, be part of a collective bargaining unit. People also should have the ability to say, no, I don't want to be in a union. And in Pennsylvania, you don't have that right, believe it or not. If you go out to a facility that's part of what's called a collective bargaining unit, where you have an organized labor section, even if you say, I don't want to join the union, tough one, you're paying us your fair share, there's that term again, your fair share of the wages because we represent you. Well, what if you don't want to be represented? What if you're happy with the job and the company and everything else? Sorry, you have to pay to have that union represent you, which is what Michigan just did. They went to what's called a right-to-work state. So I would argue that, and I do, I push back. They say we need to increase those. A few years ago, they tried to do something called card check, which we fought heavily. Card check was a proposal by organized labor. Right now, if you want to organize, what you do is, let's say that you're all working at one company and you're all members of the potential union. The union organizer comes to each of you and says, hey, will you sign this so we can have an election to see if we want to have a union? Once they get a certain number of those signatures, they go to the National Labor Relations Board. National Labor Relations Board has a sanctioned, properly overseen, private vote on whether you're going to have a union here at, we'll call it the E-Town amphitheater workers, whatever you want to call it. You're going to decide whether or not now you all get to go in just like you do, vote in elections, and you go in and get to have a private election. What they wanted to do was, we don't like that system because the employer tells people, here's why, here's another counter. They don't want to give the employer the opportunity to present another side. So what they wanted to do was this. Instead of all of you signing a paper that says we're going to have an election, they're going to come to each of you and say, we want you to sign this card to have a union. How many people in the room? When it was 60 here? Okay, let's say there's 60 people in the room. Once you got to 31, you're now a union. There's no NLRB vote, there's no nothing. And what happens is if they don't get you at work, they have the ability to come, you're watching, I don't know, American Idol or whatever. Hey, we noticed you didn't sign your card at work. You got a problem with the union? We want you to sign this card here. They have the ability to do that. We fought that. So we didn't think that was appropriate and we were able to beat that back. Why don't people join unions? I mean, who knows? I'll give you one speculation. Well, the obvious is people don't see the value for whatever reason, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I had family who was union. I talked about the refinery where I worked. I was third generation at the refinery. My grandfather was a union electrician. My uncle was head of the union grievance committee, and my dad was there. He was a salary non-exempt clerk. So when they went on strike, my dad was locked in. My uncle was walking the picket line. I happened to miss 2 strikes, fortunately. So this is not an anti-union perspective. As I said, I think people should have the ability to join. But think about when unions started. When unions started, there were real issues in the workplace. There were issues of safety. There were issues of pay. There were issues of discrimination. What have we done in those decades since? We now have OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration at the federal level. We have the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry. We have Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the federal level. We have a similar commission at the state level. We have the US EPA on environmental issues. We have the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and just go right on down the line. If I'm a worker, maybe I'm saying, hey, you know what? I pay a lot of tax money to administer all these federal and state agencies that oversee my safety in the workplace, that oversee my environmental protections, that oversee my discrimination concerns. Maybe I don't need a union as much. That's a valid concern, and in my view, a reason to say, why should I pay twice? Whether or not people are thinking that, I don't know, but they clearly have a declining base. One more?
One more question.
If you have one.
You talked about the Marcellus Shale earlier. How do you think we should best utilize, what's been given to us as a result of that to create jobs in Pennsylvania? What's the best way to use that to create jobs in Pennsylvania?
Okay, great question. There are a number of things we can do. There are a number of things that we shouldn't do. The first thing is, and I think the governor's been right, there are people calling for a severance tax. That is, when you pull it out of the ground, you pay this. The reality is they're paying the property owner already to lease the land. They're paying the property owner a royalty on the gas they take out. People have asked for a severance tax as well. Now, people say, well, Texas has a severance tax. Yeah, Texas doesn't have a 9.99% corporate net income tax rate like we do. If you make the tax structure, just like everything else, you make the cost and tax structure so high that people can't economically take it out of the ground, then you're not going to get that stuff out of the ground, which is why it's been there all these years, because we haven't figured out technologically how to take it out, and the economics weren't there as well. The other thing that we need to do, well, there's a couple other things. One is we need to develop more implementation of natural gas in the transportation side. Right now, they're producing so much, it has depressed the price, and we are losing rigs to other states because the price isn't enough to keep them up. We need to get more utilization and more uses for the natural gas. That's another one. There was a third one that I was going to throw out, but we need to work on all of those. We need to use more natural gas. It's cheaper than crude. We produce it here. Trouble is getting the vehicle manufacturers to make it. We need more transportation infrastructure to move the natural gas from place to place, because otherwise you can't put it in the back of a car and haul it from here to there. It needs to be transported by pipeline, and that infrastructure needs to be built. So there are a number of things we can do with it.
Yeah, my understanding of it was that there were options of whether to build a pipeline and
Yes.
sell it to another state or sell it out of our.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say. You're absolutely right.
Keeping it and doing it
Well,
with it like that Procter & Gamble business.
if we don't allow it to be exported, we're not going to be able to develop the resources fully as possible. Right now, 16% of the natural gas used in the province of Ontario is Pennsylvania natural gas. That's money that's coming back to Pennsylvania. We never did that before. We were buying natural gas from Texas and Oklahoma. We're now using our own, and the money's staying here. Williamsport, north of here, second or third fastest growing metro area in the United States in the last few years, Marcellus Shale. They're building department stores downtown. When's the last time you heard of that? You don't hear that anymore. It's all related to Marcellus. 109,000 jobs so far, direct, indirect, and induced. That is hospitality industry, et cetera. Lots of stuff coming in. That means more tax revenues on top of jobs. The highest average starting salary in the entire Penn State system is now Penn College in Williamsport, because they developed the Marcellus Shale curriculum. Kids are coming out of there at $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year with not even four-year degrees. So it has made a tremendous difference to Pennsylvania, and I think it still will if we develop it in the right way. Okay, all right.
Okay, Mr.
Thank you.
Barr, thank you.